Welcome back to class. Today we want to go over the survey of the genealogy that's found in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 1, verse 1 to 17. I invite you, if you've done this assignment, to get your work out. Otherwise, you can just watch me walk through this passage. Again, this is on the genealogy in Matthew, and want to make some observations. Again, when we talk about structure, we're talking about creating an outline and or a chart. So I've charted this out sideways. You can also do vertical charts where they drop down. You can also just do a straight up outline. And for the genealogy, I want you to note that I've broken up the genealogy into three main units. Verse 1, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, and the son of Abraham. There's a couple different ways that verse 1 could be divided. You could break it up into the three titles that are given for that. So, in other words, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, the son of David, or the son of Abraham. You could also divide it into maybe two parts, account of the genealogy of Jesus, and then the second part, the three titles, Christ, son of David, and son of Abraham. I think you'll see why I've moved to this, why I've broken it down this way here in just a minute. The larger genealogy itself starts at verse 1-2, where we begin with Abraham, and it goes to David in verse 6a, and then we have the second section, David, to the only non-human that shows up in the genealogy, the deportation or the exile to Babylon. And then the last element is from Babylon all the way to the birth of Jesus, who is called the Messiah or the Christ. And then we have the concluding verse 17, which, again, same pattern, has Abraham to David, David to Babylon, Babylon to the Messiah, and uses the number 14 in each place. So that seems to be a fairly straightforward way of breaking this material into three main units. Now, some people may have broken it into five, and the five would have essentially been the pieces that we have right here. Now, does that make this wrong? Not necessarily. The thing that I want to encourage you to do as you learn inductive Bible study is you want to use as few main units as possible, and you might note that these three subunits of my second main unit, they follow the same pattern, because you have this genealogical pattern where it's so-and-so's the father of somebody else. And so in a sense, these are all similar. So I've pulled these together into one big unit that I just titled From Abraham to the Christ. Okay, so that's the first step. So when you do a survey, you want to have the main units and subunits, and then you want to look for structures that connect or work within your main units. Now, what's important when you're learning inductive Bible study is you're not going to literally list out every single structure that you might find, but what you want to discern are what structures connect your unit. So like what connects unit 1 to unit 2, or unit 2 to unit 3, or unit 3 back, or perhaps what connects all three main units. That's a major structure connects main units. That's the first piece. Or a major structure controls at least 50% of the material. Okay, so in other words, if you have a structure that maybe is functioning within unit 2, only in unit 2, so it's not connecting the other units. As long as it would control 50% of the material, that would also be a major structure. Okay, so let's start off. How does unit 1 connect with unit 2? Well, this would be a structure that we could call particularization. And particularization is when you have a general statement that then is particularized. In other words, gives specific examples. And notice that verse 1 is a broad statement. It says, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, and the son of Abraham. So that would be the general statement. And so verse 1 is the general statement, and its particulars would be verses 2 to 16. So this would be an example of a particularization. And some of you may have noticed that this particularization also has embedded in it one of the secondary or auxiliary structures of chiasm. And what I mean by that is, notice how verse 1 read. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Christ, the son of David, and the son of Abraham. So you have Christ, son of David, Abraham. And then how does it move forward? Well, it starts with Abraham, goes to David, and then goes to the Christ. Okay? And so in other words, this is a particularization with a chiasm. And the chiasm has to do with the Christ, David, Abraham in verse 1, and then the genealogy itself breaks out Abraham, David, Christ. So in other words, this would be A, B, C, C, B, A. So particularization with chiasm. When you combine structures, that's called a complex structure. And I do want to remind you that whenever you find an auxiliary structure like chiasm or inclusio, that you're always going to connect it back with another major structure. Okay, that's the first structure. Now, also part of survey is to ask questions. So you're going to ask a definitional question, a rational question, and an implicational question. And you can see the class notes for this, so you can check these out in our online course. But like an example of a definitional question here would be, what is the precise and specific meaning of each element in the general statement in 1:1? Example of a rational question would be, why is unit 1 connected to unit 2 with particularization? You could also ask, why is a chiasm used here? And then the implicational question would be something like, what are the implications? Okay, so that's the first structure that we find here. Now let's go to a second structure. Now you may have noticed, and it depends on your translation, but in verse 17 you get a word like so. This is explicit in the Greek text. There's actually a particle here that connects verse 17 to verse 16, so an English translation might have so or then or thus. In Greek, you have the particle un that sits here for or therefore. And so this signals that we have a movement from cause to effect. And so our second structure, again, your structures can be in any order, but a second structure would be causation. In other words, the detailed report of Jesus' genealogy in verses 2 to 16 So the genealogy itself is the cause, and the effect would be verse 17. And you want to describe this a little bit, which is essentially a summarization of the genealogy. And so verse 17 essentially summarizes the rest of the genealogy by observing a uniform progression of 14 generations between key points. And so this could also be another one of these complex structures. And there's two different structures. I'm going to, you can have, maybe you saw this as generalization, or maybe you saw it as a summarization, verse 17. They're very similar. I think sometimes some IBS teachers just eliminate summarization altogether and just go with and just say there's a structure called generalization. But in other words, verse 17 is another general statement, and you might call this a summarization because it's really specific and adds on that 14 generational kind of rubric that pulls those things together. So that would be a second structure that we see here. By the way, you could also just simply break out separately and have summarization or generalization by itself here. Okay, what's another structure? Well, we have a couple of things that are actually contrasted here. So we're going to list a few different contrasts. These could all be separate structures, but the first structure that I want, the first contrast that I want to point out here would be a structure between the mention of exile versus persons. Because that's one of the things that stands out. Obviously, this is a genealogy about people. So you have this repetition of all the people that are born. And it's just really interesting that when you get to verses 11 and 12, that what's mentioned isn't more people, but the genealogy itself is you have a mention of an event, and matter of fact, a tragic event, the Babylonian exile. And it's the only historical chronological marker that's in the entire genealogy. And in fact, you could even say that it interrupts otherwise the flow of the genealogy from person to person. So we want to note this contrast. There's a contrast between the exile itself, again, verses 11 and 12. It's also mentioned here in 17, and the persons in the genealogy. There's a second contrast, but I'm going to mention the second contrast in combination with what I think you have to mark as the climax of the genealogy itself, which is the birth of Jesus. The birth of Jesus gets the most space here. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So you get a little bit more information, and clearly this idea of the Messiah being born is the climactic high point of the genealogy. But we also want to note a little bit about the contrast here, because verse 16 records the birth of Jesus as well, and the manner of the birth itself, as well as the amount of the space devoted to it, places it in contrast to the rest of the genealogy. So we have a climax with contrast involving the birth of Jesus. In verse 16. And it's clear from the genealogy here that this is the point, right? It moves from Christ to Christ. We also want to note, in terms of a little bit of a difference pieces, is there's no statement, unlike all the other fathers in the genealogies, there's no direct statement of the relationship between Joseph and Jesus. All we have is Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. So we have this reported in a way that stands in contrast to the rest of the figures that are here. Okay, another structure. We have some recurrences that take place. And the recurrences would be, what we have is we have the recurrence of women. Because you probably noticed that most of this genealogy is so-and-so beget so-and-so, right? And if you included that in the survey, that's fine. But the piece that really stands out in terms of true recurrence is the presence of the mention of women in the genealogy itself. And I'm sure that you noticed that in key places here in the genealogy, we get Tamar, Ruth, and Rahab mentioned in this first section here. We get, interestingly enough, the wife of Uriah sits here up mentioned around David, and then we get Mary shows up in this third phase. And these stand out as exceptional. Again, I'm going to make another video where I'm going to lay out some of the theological implications of all this. But let's just note that we have a recurrence of women. And you could even count that in a way as a contrast, because this in a genealogy that's dominated by, again, men, fathers begetting, we have the inclusion of these 5 women. Again, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, and Mary. Another recurrence, and this only happens twice, but it is interesting, and I want to name this because some of you may have noticed this. Verse 2 has the phrase, father of Judah and his brothers. And then you also have the language of brothers in verse 11. And so you have the mention of brothers. And I'll talk about that in the interpretation video also. Okay. So these are some of the key structures. Now, there's also, and some of you probably saw this, beyond just seeing this as the climax here, and you also have a structure, and this would be what's known as cruciality that takes place, is basically you start at Abraham, could have put it here, but basically we have a movement from Abraham to David as kind of a highlight. And then there's a signal that something's going on here that's kind of negative, where it says, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, right? And we know from the story, and presumably the people that are receiving this genealogy, because of that language, they're either going to already know what the backstory is there to David, or it's the language itself is going to invite them to say, hey, what is this? And do the research. But it's pretty clear that this is supposed to be viewed in the negative. And so you have a turn from David's reign. So we have a cruciality here that then crashes down to the Babylonian exile. So that this is a low point. And then, maybe surprisingly, there's a turn back upwards that leads to Christ. And so this is a recurrence of cruciality that you want to take notice here, that we have some contrast here between the genealogy going up, the genealogy going down, and then we have some contrast here. And you might think, well, like what kind of contrast do you mean? Well, what's interesting is this ends up kind of essentially casting the kings, because these are all kings that come in this place here, in a slightly negative light compared to the people before the kings. And also, when you read this section of the genealogy, these folks are certainly less well known and almost, we're not going to call them anonymous, these are people and the names show up here, but definitely less well known than the king. So there's some contrast that takes place here. We get a negative climax off of this cruciality. We get a positive climax off of this cruciality. Now, what else gets included in a survey? Again, for every structure that we've listed, and again, look at the notes for more details on these. For every structure listed, you're going to have a set of questions, and you're also going to have strategic areas. So like, for example, verse 1 would be a great strategic area for the particularization that we see. Okay. You're also going to have literary form. That would probably be a genealogy, because what else would you call a genealogy? The atmosphere, I describe the atmosphere as formal and terse. And then some major impressions that I noted, and you should also note your major impressions. The genealogy seems to point to significance. There's interruptions by women, the deportation, the label king that's given to David, the title Christ. There's some things that stand out in the genealogy. Also, the orderliness, you have to be impressed by that. And then also it kind of begs the question, what's going on with this number 14? And then I think also just the way that Jesus's birth is portrayed. How can it be said that Jesus is truly a descendant of Abraham and David if Joseph isn't the biological father? Okay, you want to see the next video for some of my interpretive conclusions about this, but this would be the survey itself. Let me know if you have questions. If you're in class, you can ask them in the forums. If you're just watching this video on YouTube, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope to others.